Hello everyone, so are you ready for this clash between Alireza Firouzja with white and Magnus Carlsen with black? Round 1 of the Norway chess tournament. And already these two top players are going to meet. And a game that's going to live up to its promise, let's take a look. Firouzja has white and he opens with the queen pawn to d4. Carlsen responds with d5, symmetry, c4, the queen's gambit, an invitation to deflect the black pawn away from the center. But Carlsen plays e6, he consolidates. Now both players are going to bring out the knights, right? Knight to f3, knight f6, knight c3, and a little surprise from Carlsen, who's going to insert the move h6. It's the 9th move of the theory, meaning that in the databases we find 8 more popular moves that are played much more often, notably bishop e7, bishop b4, c6, knight d7. But Carlsen plays this move h6 certainly to take Firouzja out of his opening preparation, but Firouzja plays a 3. In the end, both players are going to prevent the pin of the knights by the bishops. Here Carlsen is going to play c5. A critical move nonetheless, right? You must have faced this kind of move with this quartet of pawns. A very explosive tension, the pawns can capture each other in every direction. So obviously you have to be careful not to lose a pawn, but you also have to be careful about creating isolated pawns. And besides, look at what's going to happen. Firouzja takes on d5, Carlsen takes back. And here Firouzja at any moment can start taking the pawn on c5 to create the isolated pawn on d5, that is to say a pawn, which won't be defended by other pawns. And yet Firouzja doesn't do it. Why? Because he doesn't want to speed up Carlsen's development with the bishop coming out to c5. A threatening move nonetheless. So Firouzja will prefer to develop his bishop to f4 and wait for Carlsen to take. That way the knight will take back. Black will have the isolated pawn, but on Firouzja's terms. But obviously Carlsen isn't going to take, and he's also going to develop. Knight to c6, pawn e3. a6 can support the b5 push. Bishop e2 and Carlsen plays c4. Now we have to look at this pawn structure. You can't play this game without understanding the structure of pawns. Here Carlsen still has a lot of assets. In the center, he has this semi-open file, which offers him quite a bit of space, 5 squares, with double control of the e4 square. So there's a certain grip by black on the center. But black also has a majority of pawns on the queen side. The a6 pawn, the b7 pawn, and the c4 pawn are part of a majority of 3 pawns against 2. And so Carlsen can look to advance with this majority, to play b5 and at some point maybe a5, b4, and to come into conflict with the pawn minority to create a passed pawn. So what does Firouzja have to try to compensate for the control of the e4 square, the space on the semi-open e-file? The pawn majority of 3 pawns against 2 on the queen side, what does he have? Well, he's going to have the attack on the camouflage backward pawn. But what is a camouflage backward pawn? Well, it's a pawn that's at the back of the pawn structure. The d5 pawn is backward, and it has no possibility of advancing, obviously. And it's hidden. Why? Because we don't have an attacking file due to the d4 pawn. The heavy pieces, rooks and queens, cannot attack it. So ultimately that helps in defending this backward pawn, since white can attack it less. Nevertheless, this d5 pawn can still be targeted. The knight attacks. And if the bishop on e2 goes to f3, it can join the attack on the d5 pawn. But it's insufficient. Now, it's true that if black hadn't played h6, we could have had the bishop on g5, which pins the knight on f6 to prevent it from defending d5. That's perhaps why as well we saw the h6 pawn arrive. But here, Firouzja is going to make a move that's thematic in these structures. He'll play knight to e5. Because obviously if Carlsen takes, the pawn can retake, drive the black knight from the defense and open the file. The backward pawn will no longer be hidden, since the file will open up to attack it. So knight e5 is played. Carlsen cannot take, as I just explained to you. And this knight move to e5 frees the f3 square for the bishop to put pressure on the d5 pawn. Carlsen plays bishop d6. Both players perform kingside castling. And bishop g3. Why bishop g3? The bishop might want to go to h4 as well at certain points to pin the knight on f6. But here it's mainly played to free the f-pawn to be able to play a 4. That way the knight is untouchable, because if black takes, the pawn recapture sometimes creates forks. But this pawn on e5 will be very well defended, driving away the black knight, opening the file. So there the knight on e5 after a 4 will be almost untouchable. But this 4 pawn push has the disadvantage of creating a weak square on e4, a hole in the position. A hole that Carlsen is going to exploit very, very well. He's going to be very clever in his exploitation. Look, he plays bishop f5. He's expecting exactly this f4 push, which takes place. Immediately, in fact, f4. And then bishop e7. Why this bishop retreat? Here, Carlsen frees the queen so she can join the defense of the d5 pawn with the knight because he understands that bishop f3 is coming. In fact, it's played. And then bishop e7 is also played to fight against the pin from the dark squared bishop because the knight wants to go to e4. And so it must not be pinned. And it must not be eliminated by the black square bishop, which, by the way, becomes a bad bishop in this structure anyway. All these pawns on dark squares hinder the view and action of Firouzja's dark squared bishop. Rook c8, if we want to push b5, the knight must be protected. So rook c8, rook c1, and Carlsen sends b5. The bishop comes to e1, and Carlsen sends b4. Very active on the queen side, capture on b4, bishop takes b4, and there's a strategic danger for Firouzja. It's the danger of the light squares of the color play on the e4 square. The e4 square is a light square, a weak square, and so Carlsen will want to exchange the bishop for the knight. To have double control of this square on e4. And that's why Firouzja will immediately play bishop h4 to go and pin the knight on f6 now that the bishop e7 is not there. Both players are trying to eliminate the knights or neutralize them so they can't take part in the battle for the e4 square. Bishop takes c3 by Carlsen, then the pawn recapture, queen d6 unpinning. And here the knight is about to go to e4, and we could understand if Firouzja takes. Taking is a good move. But Firouzja doesn't take, he's going to play rook a1. He's going to attack this isolated pawn on a6. We might expect a somewhat passive defense like rook a8, but not from Carlsen. No. He's going to leave the pawn on a6. What's happening is very interesting. He'll leave the pawn on a6. He'll sacrifice this pawn to play for the e4 square. He's not going to give Firouzja time to play bishop takes knight now. He plays knight e4. So sure, Firouzja couldn't play bishop takes knight, but he's going to win the pawn on a6. But we have to understand what's going on. Carlsen might be a pawn down, but Firouzja's extra pawn is on e3. It's a backward pawn with no chance of advancing, even less so on white squares. Now that Firouzja has one less piece to fight on the white squares, since the dark squared bishop is unable to fight on the white squares, he'll never be able to unlock those white squares, to reclaim those white squares, with such a dark squared bishop, which is also very passive. And the knight on e4 attacks the backward c3 pawn. If that c3 pawn is won, the c4 pawn will become a passed pawn. So the knight on e4 is very strong. You might say it can be eliminated, which is what will happen, by the way. It'll end up being eliminated, but the bishop will have a very nice spot. First, Carlsen will play f6. It blocks the dark squared bishop. It pushes back the knight, so it helps control the dark squares. Firouzja eliminates the knight on e4, bishop recapture, the knight comes to g4, queen d7. Unpinning from the rook's 6th rank, the knight comes to f2 to attack the bishop and get rid of it. And here again, a great move of understanding from Carlsen, who plays knight e7. Magnificent. Carlsen, he allows knight takes bishop, even if it blocks the square with the pawn recapture, because it blocks the square. But it frees up, one, the d5 square for the knight, which will block the d4 passed pawn and attack the structural bases c3, e3, the two backward pawns, while leaving the bishop still inactive and passive. A pawn down for Carlsen and yet a better pawn structure. Look, queen e2 is played, so rook c6, piece exchange offer accepted, rook takes, queen takes, knight takes, e4 pawn takes, and we see that the knight will arrive on d5. Firouzja takes possession of the a-file, knight d5, and the bishop comes back at full speed to defend c3. And we can clearly see that the knight on d5 dominates the bishop on e1. Now, it's true that Firouzja has an extra pawn, but the knight on d5 is very, very well placed with pressure on c3 and on e3. And the bishop, which is unable to participate in any offensives in the position. Rook b8, we can look to enter on b3 to attack c3 once again. The queen controls a8. That way, if the rook moves, it prevents an intrusion on the 8th rank. But Firouzja plays f5. He doesn't want to die a slow death. He's going to start an action on the king side. King h7, queen g4, very nice. Move by Firouzja, queen g4, a very, very nice move. You have to understand all the stakes of queen g4. It attacks a 4. It would allow for checks in certain situations. And it attacks g7 with threats like rook a7, attacks on the 7th rank, and mating attacks. One might think that knight takes a 3 is interesting. It frees the queen to protect the e4 pawn, The knight attacks the white queen. The knight would threaten to make forks. But after knight takes a 3, the knight is undefended like the rook. And white could play, for example, queen g3. White can even give a check first and then come to g3 to make the fork of the two pieces. And let's not forget the 7th rank, which can also be played at any time by the rook. That's why Carlsen will prefer to play queen d7. He gives up the e4 pawn but monitors the 7th rank. He prevents rook a7 from arriving. And with queen d7, he'll prepare the counterattack on the e-file. Look, queen takes e4 is played. Rook e8, counterattack on the e-file. We attack the queen and the backward pawn on e3. Firouzja plays queen g4, and now it's a disaster. Carlsen cracks because there's a very subtle move that he probably didn't see. Let me explain. Everything makes us want to play knight takes a 3 here. Take this pawn, attack the queen, have the forks on c2 to attack the rook and then the bishop. But suddenly Carlsen hesitates. He doesn't have much time though, 2 minutes 42 against 1 minute. He has a bit more time than Firouzja, but he shouldn't hesitate for long, especially since we're only at move 33 and the time increment is only at move 40. Move 41 actually, to be exact. So in this position, why doesn't he take the e3 pawn? It seems like the perfect move. He fears queen g6 check. And for example, after king g8, Firouzja would have a very interesting move. It wasn't played in the game, but I have to show you because it's the turning point of the match. Firouzja could have played rook a7 to deflect the black queen. It's hard for the black queen to ignore the rook because it attacks the queen and then mate. But the problem is if the black queen takes the rook, she's deflected from protecting the rook on e8, and suddenly the white queen can take the rook on e8 with check and then take the knight, like playing billiards. Boom, boom. I'll show you. Queen takes rook check, king moves, queen takes knight, and an extra piece. And the passed a4 pawn. And so Carlsen doesn't want to play knight takes e3. He thinks it doesn't work. And yet it does work. Because Carlsen certainly missed the super move in the variation. I'll show you on knight takes a3, queen g6 check, king g8, rook a7. There's a super move for black that turns everything around. I'll give you a few moments to try and find it. Now it's a move that allows one to hold the position. It's not a move that will win for black, but it's a move that prevents losing at least. You can pause the video. Did you find this move for black? I don't know, it's tough. Faced with the rook to a7 sacrifice, white's deflection sacrifice. Black must leave their queen where it is and play knight to d1. The idea is deadly. If rook takes queen, then rook takes bishop is mate, because the knight controls the f2 square. But you might say the bishop just has to move and it'll be the same problem. If the queen takes, we win the rook. Yes, but the difference is that if captured, on queen takes rook check, the king moves, but the queen can't catch the knight anymore since it moved to d1 to create that mate threat. It's no longer on e3. So in the position, knight takes e3 was possible. But as you've realized, Carlsen was very afraid of queen g6 check, followed by rook a7. He certainly hadn't seen this move, knight d1. So Carlsen plays king g8 to avoid the checks, but that allows playing e4. It allows Firouzja to save the pawn, who's up 2 pawns, and pushes back the knight. Then the knight comes to a3, attacks the queen, threatens the fork, but queen f3. Knight c2 is played. Rook c1, knight a3. The bishop redeploys to g3, knight b5, the push to e5. And now Carlsen resigns. He has 9 seconds left in the position. Against 43 for Firouzja, but there's soon a time increment. In 2 moves, there will be this time increment of 10 seconds per move. But Carlsen refuses to continue because being down 2 pawns is just terrible. It's these 2 pawns right here. And now he has no real way to stop this pawn march, this phalanx of pawns that will advance, push back the black pieces, and create various tactical or promotion threats. So the game has become completely winning for Firouzja. You just have to look at the analysis bar, by the way, which is totally white now. So what did you think of this game, of this first round between Firouzja and Carlsen? It's cruel for Carlsen because he played a very nice plan, sacrificing a pawn to dominate the color game, dominating the white squares, leaving Firouzja's dark squared bishop quite harmless. He missed this move, knight d1, in a very critical variation. But it's understandable, it was a very difficult move to find. Well, you can leave a like, comment, share the video, and support the channel. Goodbye, everyone.